The Charlotte Ledger Podcast is a member of the Queen City Podcast Network.
Hey, it's Tony Messia with the Charlotte Ledger, and you're listening to the Charlotte Ledger Podcast. You can find out more about the Charlotte Ledger at thecharlotteledger.com. Today's episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast is something a little different. It's a recording of arts critic Lawrence Toppman speaking at the Sharon at SouthPark Retirement Community on December 1st, 2025, where he gives a talk about holiday movies. But before we get into that, I want to let you know about the sponsor of today's podcast, Child Care Search, which is a service of Child Care Resources, Inc. You know, finding childcare is more than checking a box. It's peace of mind. And for over 40 years, Child Care Search, which is a service of Child Care Resources, Inc., has helped families find safe, nurturing, quality childcare options. Their free referral service connects you to licensed programs that fit your family's needs. Visit findchildcarenc.org or call 1-888-600-1685 to talk to a child care navigator today. Okay, so Lawrence Toppman, he's giving a speech December 1st, 2025 at the Sharon at SouthPark Retirement Community, and it's about holiday movies that he recommends. And he steers away from the ones we all know about, like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street and Elf. Although I will say he does have some pointed comments about Elf toward the end of the talk. But instead of focusing on those, he focuses on high-quality holiday movies you might not have seen or even heard of. And I always love hearing Larry talk about things he's passionate about. He writes our Toppman on the Arts newsletter for the Charlotte Ledger, and it has arts reviews of major productions, shows at neighborhood theaters, and a lot more. And so to opt into Toppman on the arts, go to thecharlotteledger.com and go to your My Account page. And there you can opt into Toppman on the arts and a lot of our other newsletters. But let's get to the talk on holiday movies with Lawrence Toppman.
Before we get into this, by saying two things. When I was asked to come and do this today, I thought, well, I'm going to do there'll be two requirements for what I talk about today. And by the way, there'll be questions at the end, but if you have questions in the middle, just stick a hand up and I will be glad to answer them. First thing was I had to have actually seen all the movies that I talked about. When I was looking for Hanukkah movies, and believe me, there are not many, there was one that fascinated me called The Hebrew Hammer, and it was about a guy who was trying to stop Santa's evil son from killing off all of the non-Christian holiday events. And it showed a guy in a yarmulke and a cape, and his fist was out like he was delivering a punch to Santa's evil son. I thought, I've got to see that. But since I haven't seen it, I didn't put it on this list. So this is all stuff I've actually seen. Second thing is, I figure you all have seen, maybe many times, It's a Wonderful Life, and Elf, and Christmas Carol, and National Lampoon's Vacation, and Home Alone, and all the stuff that gets run 1,000 times at Christmas, A Christmas Story. Not because these are bad, am I leaving them off the list, but you don't need me to tell you about that. I will say I have seen 11 versions of A Christmas Carol. If you're wondering which is the best, at least for my money, it's George C. Scott, and from about 83, maybe 84. And that's the one that my wife and I, and sometimes our in-laws, if they come over, that's what we watch at Christmas. But a lot of them are good. Here's my George C. Scott story before we start. I had the shortest interview in my 46-year journalism career with George C. Scott. It was on the film Firestarter. In the early 80s, it was a Stephen King adaptation shot up in the mountains and in Chimney Rock and so forth. And I went up on the set and I was doing a story. And I said to the publicist, do you think I could interview George C. Scott? And she said, yes, I do. Wait till there's a break. And then go up to him politely and explain who you are. I said, okay. So there's a break. And I went up and said, Mr. Scott, Lawrence Toppman from the Charlotte Observer. I'm doing a story from the set about Firestarter, restarting the film industry here in North Carolina. May I speak to you for a few minutes? And he said, no. I said, oh, I'm sorry if I'm bothering you. The publicist said that it would be okay if I approached you on a break. And he said, well, she was wrong. And he got up and left. So that was it. I got 5 words with George C. Scott, which found their way into the paper with a whole bunch of humorous backstory so that I could actually explain that I had talked to him. So you can see why he's a great Scrooge. That's just his natural personality. I don't know about the good Scrooge at the end probably is not his natural personality. When I thought about holiday movies, I mean, I could have just done Christmas movies, and that wouldn't have been difficult. But I thought, I'm going to do the holidays of November, December, and take kind of a wider view of what's available to us. And so I'm going to start early in November, go all the way through to the end of December, and cover a much wider range than if I just did Christmas movies, partly because, as I say, all the famous Christmas movies are well known to everybody. The first actual holiday in November, really, is the Day of the Dead. I'm a big fan of the Day of the Dead. I grew up with folks who had lived in Mexico and who celebrated it. And in a way, it is, and all of these movies will be, reflective of something positive about the human spirit, something resilient, something meaningful, which is also, of course, what Christmas and the holidays themselves are all about. A little while ago, Pixar did a movie called Coco, which is the last great Pixar movie. And Pixar made some great movies, Up, Inside Out, many, many movies. And that was when John Lasseter was still working there, and before his career took an unfortunate turn. And it's about a little boy who dreams of becoming a musician, and his family has no time for this vision at all. They want him to work as a cobbler, as somebody who has upheld the family tradition of working with his hands. But he believes his real ancestor was a great actor-singer in the old days of Mexican cinema. And that man has passed away. And the little boy understands that once a year, you can transform and get into the land of the dead and visit your ancestors. And he wants to be with that man, get him to admit he's his real father, not the guy who's living with him now and leading a very mundane life, and get the world to see that he too can be a star. And it's a funny movie. It's very touching. There's some wonderful songs, obviously mariachi and Mexican polka-themed songs. And so Coco is the first holiday movie I would suggest because it's a holiday that's, meaningful for a large swath of the world, but it also upholds the values of what we think of as holiday movies. I know it's animated. My wife said, don't tell them about animated movies. They won't want to watch them. My belief is animated movies can tell a story that's as profound, funny, clever, touching as any other kind of live action movie. And so I'm overriding my wife, which I hardly ever do, and saying that I think you ought to think about taking a look at Coco. The second holiday on my list in November is what used to be called Armistice Day. It was called that when I was an infant. Armistice Day became Veterans Day in the 1950s. It was Armistice Day until then. It was to commemorate the last signing of a peace treaty in World War I. The reason it's on November 11th is the treaty was signed at 11/11 on November 11, 1918, I guess. And so it became Veterans Day after the United States. It was going to decide to not just honor veterans of World War I, but at that point, World War II in Korea. My dad is a Korean veteran. And so he takes that holiday very seriously. So I'm recommending a couple of really beautiful movies that capture the spirit of that time, show what people fought for, show the difficulties of war, but also show the heroism involved, the sacrifice involved, the bravery involved. One of them is fictional, one of them is not. 1917 is a British film from the director Sam Mendes, and it was nominated for many Academy Awards. It won a bunch of technical ones. It is one of the most beautiful movies visually I've ever seen. But the second movie is even perhaps more heartrending. It's called They Shall Not Grow Old, which is taken from a poem, I believe, by Wilfred Owen. I think that's right. And Peter Jackson, who to me is a big budget guy who makes inflated, dull, overextended movies like the multiple versions of The Hobbit, actually has made a beautiful, concise, sad, but also kind of reassuring and uplifting film using footage that had never before been seen in World War I. It's just as jaw-dropping movie. It's a documentary, but he tells it as if it were a narrative. And when I saw that, I just thought, okay, this guy has an amazing talent that I don't see when you allow him to make movies that are 8 hours long and give him $600 million to make them. Somewhere inside of him, there's a guy who can tell a story beautifully, economically, and touchingly. So I would recommend either of those if you want to see war movies. Those are really very moving. Then there was a little gap between World War I and Armistice Day and Thanksgiving. And, you know, in order to do this, I kind of cheated. I went online and was like, give me titles of Thanksgiving movies. And up came 100 movies. And almost, 90% of them, 80% of them, were about, hi, our family gets together at Thanksgiving and fights and acts crazy. And in the end, in the last 20 minutes of the film, we discover that we all love each other and our family's in wonderful shape. That's nothing wrong with that. That's not my Thanksgiving. When I was a little kid, it was all harmonious and amiable, and our relatives didn't fight or call each other crazy names. We just enjoyed a meal. So I understand that's too dull for Hollywood. They can't dramatize that. But those movies all tended to be the same movie. Not a bad thing, but not a very interesting thing to me. Because what I want is a story I haven't always seen. Maybe it has a little bit of a different outcome. Maybe it has something that's a little bit more dramatic and honest. So I have picked 4 movies over the years that have really stood out for me. And the funny thing was, I didn't need to look at these on Google. These were 4 titles I had to begin with, and they're the 4 titles with which I ended up. Hannah and Her Sisters was sort of near the end of the golden time when Woody Allen films were distinct from each other and new and really honest and funny, but also had more meat to them. And he became kind of a movie factory in this century. But in the 70s and 80s, his films were really compelling. They could make you laugh, but they could also kind of make you wince a little, like, ow, that's funny, but it also gets me kind of where it pinches a little bit. And Hannah and Her Sisters is rare for him. Almost all the films that he made are about guys as the center of the action and the center of the theme, the center of the idea. Hannah and Her Sisters, 3 women who are indeed sisters. They are the centers of the action. They are the important characters. And the men are important, but they kind of revolve around them like moons around planets. The women are stable. The women are more interesting than the men. The women have more going on in their lives emotionally than the men. And Allen kind of stepped out of his comfort zone to tell that story. Michael Caine plays the husband of one of them who falls in love with another one. The sisters are played by Barbara Hershey, Diane Wiest, and Mia Farrow. And Woody Allen is the ex-husband of one of them who keeps trying to get back into the life of his ex-wife. And I would say I watched that movie about every 6 or 7 years since it came out in 88, 86. And I do it because I identify with different characters each time. And that's the sign of a really complex film, where you're not just watching a narrative or a relationship between 2 people, you're watching an arc that involves a whole bunch of different people, all of whom have distinct and interesting lives. And this film does that. Then I'm going to move on to a movie called Avalon. Barry Levinson has made a lot of films. He kind of peaked also in the 80s and 90s. Diner was the first movie, if you ever saw that, that kind of made him known to the general public. It's very funny. It's also crass. It reminded me, the crass parts, of the guys I went to college with. And that put him on the map. But then he started to make more autobiographical, more sentimental movies that were really more about him and not about exaggerated kinds of people that he had encountered. He made Liberty Heights. He made Tin Men about air traffic controllers. But the best of them is Avalon. Despite his anglicized upbringing, he was born in the U.S. He comes from a Polish-Jewish family. His mother emigrated from Poland, I think maybe as a little girl with her parents. And so this story is about what it's like when you are an immigrant who is determined to assimilate. And what does that mean? It means you got to give up some of your identity, but you also want to retain some of your identity. You have to figure out a way not to seem too exotic to the white bread community into which you're moving, but you also don't want to seem so middle of the road that you don't feel that you're the same person anymore. You may want to think about marrying outside the faith. You may wonder if it's okay with your family to let you marry outside the faith. In my case, that's very relevant. This is interesting partly because I had a Polish grandmother, and partly because my father was the first person in his line born in the U.S. His father was born in Ukraine. And he married outside the faith. He was Jewish, and he married a Presbyterian. And so the movie is about all these things. And it seems to me if you've had that experience or know someone who's had it, you will find it very, very honest. And it's funny, but it's also more dramatic. It's not like Diner funny, which is mostly gag after gag after gag. And there's a very funny sequence that happens at Thanksgiving where if I'm encouraging you to watch it, I don't want to spoil it by saying what the funny thing is that happens at Thanksgiving. I'll just tell you it would well be worth finding. The next movie is Pieces of April. And in a way, it follows the template I was whining about earlier of a dysfunctional family coming together and realizing that they have enough in common that they can, in fact, connect as a family. It's about a young woman played by Katie Holmes, who, if you have ever sort of written her off as a TV actress, you will be forced to revamp your opinion of, playing a woman who has left her family, not run away, just moved away, because she doesn't fit them and they don't fit her. She's a free spirit, she's bohemian, and she's living in New York in an apartment which neither you nor I nor certainly her family would approve of. It is run down. But her mom, played by Patricia Clarkson, who got an Oscar nomination for this and who was off the charts good, is dying and wants to see her daughter again and reestablish a relationship with her that has been allowed to lapse. And she feels like this is her last chance to go and see her and to bring along with her family members who are uneasy about how to approach her. There's a very funny cooking scene which ends in failure. Maybe I find that funny because the rare times I've cooked at Thanksgiving, they have, without exception, ended in some sort of failure or a disaster. That's not true. That's not true. I made butterscotch pudding for my wife this Thanksgiving. I got 2 boxes, a quart of milk, and stirred it while it boiled for 15 minutes without spilling any on my shirt. So that was a triumph. But other than that, the times I've tried to make something more complicated, it looks like something you'd pick up at the construction site off the ground. But this movie is, despite the failed cooking scene, which is very funny, mostly a drama and very touching. Pieces of April. It was inspired, of all things, by a Three Dog Night song. That's got to be the only movie ever inspired by a song by Three Dog Night, if you remember them, called Pieces of April. But Peter Hedges, who wrote it, wrote other movies you may have seen. He wrote What's Eating Gilbert Grape? And He wrote About a Boy, which got him an Oscar nomination, where Hugh Grant plays a father figure for a young man that is kind of adrift. And all of his films, in fact, tend to have younger people adrift, older people not knowing how to reach out to them and create a connection with them, but wanting to. And so his three major films, those three, all have that as a bond. Funny story, I saw that at the Toronto Film Festival, which I went to for about 11 years when I was the film critic of The Observer. And I thought, oh, this is a really good movie, Pieces of April. I'm going to interview Peter Hedges. And I said to him, why do your movies all tend to be about father figures or mother figures who have lost touch with their children and are struggling to is that something from your life? Why is that a subject that's so meaningful to you? And why is it a theme that runs through your movies? And he said, is it? And I thought, one, this is going to be a bad interview. But also, you're an artist, man. You made these three really good movies. You got an Oscar nomination. You don't notice that? And the answer was, he said, no, I hadn't really thought about that. They were just stories I wanted to tell. But now that you say it, I realize I'm telling the same story. I said, don't let that stop you. But that's interesting that didn't immediately come to you. And that tells us that artists don't always know what's at the core of their work. They don't always know what the subtext of their work is. They're just telling a story. It's in their mind. It's in the forefront of their mind. And then when it's done and you go, yes, but look, it lines up. They can be surprised. Peter Hedges was very surprised. Okay, I'm going to recommend a movie that I think it's really good. I think the play it's from is really good. I will warn you now, this is the only truly depressing film on this list. I thought they'll let me get away with one depressing movie on this list because it's so good and bizarre. And it's called The Humans, and it came out in 21. And the guy who wrote the play, Stephen Karam, adapted his own play, wrote his own screenplay, and then directed it. And it has a cast of actors, some of whom you'd recognize. It's got Richard Jenkins, who's a wonderful actor, tall, balding guy. You'd know him if you saw him, as the father of a group of family members who go to visit another apartment in New York that's not in such great shape. The daughter has moved in, and she's there with her young man, who's a guy played by Stephen Yeun, again, an actor you would probably know if you saw him. And they don't really know how to speak to each other. And they spend the time first trying to understand, how do you approach family members from whom you're not literally estranged, but distanced? And second, how do you tell them what's in your heart when your heart is heavy? Because there are some heavy secrets that are coming out in the course of this narrative. Not a particularly long film. It's kind of a spooky film because there's unexplained noises and you're thinking like, okay, is this one of those crazy person in the attic films? No, it's not. But the atmosphere is disturbing because the subject matter is dark. And it doesn't have a happy resolution where everybody's problems are solved, which holiday movies tend to insist on. So I thought, all right, it's real, it's touching, it's not too long. I'm going to stick it in here and recommend it. And if any of you watch it and go, man, I am so depressed, why did that guy put this in this list? And the answer is it's just a really good movie, and it only represents 8 1/3% of this list. So I thought 8%, I'm going to take a shot and stick it in there. It really is a good film, and I believe it was nominated for Best Picture and did not win. But there it is.
We'll be right back to Lawrence Toppman's talk about holiday movies. But first, wanted to remind you that this episode of the Charlotte Ledger podcast is presented by Childcare Search, Charlotte's trusted childcare guidance for families.
Okay, Hanukkah. Hanukkah is interesting because even though Hollywood was run almost entirely, the studios, almost every major studio in Hollywood for decades was run by Jews. I cannot find a Hanukkah movie made before the 1980s. They all wanted to be assimilationist. I talked about that a minute ago. They were pretending they weren't Jews. I mean, Sam Goldwyn and Leo Mayer and Adolf Zucker and those people, it was obvious that they were, but they did not want to stress their Jewishness, and they did not want to show audiences elements of that. There are hardly any films made in the golden era of Hollywood, up right into the 60s, that have Jewish characters, or if they have them, they're kind of supplementary characters, because they just felt, we're here in America, we're assimilating, we don't want to stress our national or religious identities. So nobody even made Hanukkah films until the 80s. And then what they were, hi, this is a Christmas film, but it's really just got the word Hanukkah in it. That's all it is. It's exactly like a Christmas film. Don't be threatened by it. Somebody might have a menorah, I don't know, possibly a yarmulke may show up, but it's really a Christmas film. It just happens to have Jews in it. And those to me are not terribly interesting, because if you're going to make a movie about Hanukkah, it should have Jewishness at the core of it. Otherwise, why aren't you making a Christmas movie? It's funny, I asked my dad once when I was a kid, we were watching, It's a Wonderful Life on TV, which I love, it's a great film. I said, Dad, are there Christmas movies, or Hanukkah movies, I should say, about Jews? And my father said, who would watch? Very Jewish thing to do. You answer every question with a question. And I said, well, I'd watch one. I'd like to see one. And he said, you and who else? So the answer is, Hanukkah movies not happening. And as I haven't seen The Hebrew Hammer, I'm going to recommend instead An American Tale. There have been many attempts to tell the story of Judaism and its position in the world through non-live action narratives. Many. I don't know if any of you read graphic novels, which I'm so old that I still call comic books, but there was a famous series called Maus, M-A-U-S, by Art Spiegelman that won the Pulitzer Prize. And it was a graphic novel, all drawn, that told the story of what happened to Jews in World War II. The Jews were mice and the Nazis were cats. A very interesting narrative and rather unflinching. This is not that. It is, however, about a mouse. It's about Fievel Mouskowitz. He's a mouse in Russia, and the big opening is at Hanukkah, and his patriarchal, his dad or his granddad, I can't remember, played by Nehemiah Persoff, the old character actor, is blessing him and giving him a gift. And it becomes pretty evident pretty soon that the cats, who represent Russians, are instituting a pogrom, and it's time to emigrate to the U.S. I may be prejudiced in favor of this movie because that's why my grandfather and great-grandfather came to the U.S. The Tsar's soldiers were cleaning up in the 1890s, and out they went and ended up in northern New Jersey. And they got there and moved into an all-Italian neighborhood. I suspect the Italians were as surprised by them as they were surprised by the Italians. But in this movie, he goes off to America with his family, and they get separated along the way. And Fievel has to fight his way back to reunite with his family. But what's even more interesting about this than the whole Jewish diaspora theme, which is pretty interesting, is it's really about the American melting pot. He has an Irish friend who assists him, an Italian friend who assists him. And what it represents is the best of America coming together, all of them immigrants, to help him find his family and then find his place in America as another immigrant. Again, being possibly the grandchild of immigrants, this is meaningful to me. It may not be to somebody whose family has not had immigrants in it for some generations, but I am always touched by this movie. It's animated beautifully. Steven Spielberg produced it. It was before he founded the Amblin Entertainment animation division. And it was directed by a guy named Don Bluth, who made a couple of other interesting movies. He left Disney and created his own studio, and Spielberg backed him. and this is the best of them. There's a French animal in it who's a poodle, I think, played by Christopher Plummer, and it's his voice. And this story gets me every time. This is another movie I watch every so often because it's about what makes America great, which isn't specifically that recent immigrants are making America great. Unity is making America great. And that's something that we sometimes lose track of. And right now we're in a very divisive situation around the country in a lot of places. And this movie, to me, represents what America could be and ideally would be. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. And that's what this movie is about. Yes, we are actually at Christmas movies now. I knew I would get to them eventually. As I said before, I'm staying away from the famous Christmas movies, not that I don't watch them. I'm embarrassed to admit I own 4 versions of A Christmas Carol. Why am I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I own them. In case you were wondering what the 11 versions of A Christmas Carol are, I'll go through them real fast. There's actually about 40, but I've seen 11. The live-action ones are Reginald Owen, Alastair Sim, pretty good, but they cut most of the story. Patrick Stewart, who's good, but a lot of cutting. George C. Scott, who's off the charts because he's playing himself. And Jim Carrey in one of those weird kind of animated things where they traced over the actual face of the actor, and everything in it is so freakish I can hardly watch it. Also, Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, The Muppet Christmas Carol, Scrooge with Albert Finney as a singing Scrooge, Bill Murray in Scrooged as a comedic Scrooge, A Christmas Carol with Mickey and Scrooge McDuck, whose name actually is Scrooge, so that makes it kind of pertinent. That's 10. And I once spent all of my disposable income for 2 weeks to go to a Broadway show that was a black version of A Christmas Carol called Goin' Uptown, in which Gregory Hines, a great tap dancer and singer, played Scrooge as a slumlord in Harlem. The 3 weeks that it ran were 2.5 weeks too many. But I had spent my $80, which back then was a fortune 40 years ago on Broadway, and I sat there gritting my teeth and watching all of it, including the singing and dancing Tiny Tim. And I thought, I'm sorry, doesn't Tiny Tim have like a bad leg? Should he really be able to tap? I don't think so. Call me a purist. Everybody else, yeah, not him. But no, Tiny Tim threw away his crutch and tap danced. And at the end I thought, ow. I don't know what the best Christmas Carol is, but I know now that I've seen the worst. And I'm still holding that opinion. So, Christmas movies that we may not think of quite as much. I hope we won't. And these are all really, really sweet. And in different ways show what the meaning of Christmas is about. So I'm actually ending with this, no sweat. The Shop Around the Corner is a movie that I almost had memorized the dialogue from. I've seen it so often. I'm a huge Jimmy Stewart fan, big fan. I think he is maybe the best film actor from America. He doesn't always play himself. People say that. If you watch Vertigo and other great movies he's made, you couldn't believe that. But here he plays an employee in a perfumery and a cosmetic shop in Budapest. And he works opposite a woman who drives him crazy and irritates him all day, and vice versa. He does the same to her. But they have joined a Lonely Hearts Club and communicate via anonymous letters, and they don't know that they're falling in love with the person who is most annoying to them during the day. And if you're thinking, haven't like 82 movies been made about this? The correct answer is yes, they have. This is the first one. This is the best one. You've Got Mail is a pretty good one. I like Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, but they are not Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan. And something about this, the Christmas atmosphere, the exoticism of it being set in Hungary because it comes from a play by a Hungarian playwright, it's all just too charming. And the cynic in me just completely disappears, and I fall in love with it when I watch it. I showed it to my wife. She loved it. I showed it to my nephew. He loved it. He has the attention span of a flea, but he enjoyed all of it. And so I really recommend it. It is the best of the mistaken identity romance movies that I've ever seen. And believe me, as a film critic, I saw many, but it's good. I had to choose my second movie, also from the 40s, and I chose between Holiday Affair, which is Robert Mitchum at his most engaging and friendly and likable, with one of those meet cutes where the people are mismatched. It's fun. It's a nice movie. And Christmas in Connecticut, which I really like a little bit more. Christmas in Connecticut has this message, and it's important. It's not Christmassy especially. Barbara Stanwyck plays a complete phony. She doesn't do comedy much. In her career, she hardly did comedies. She's very funny in this. And she plays a cooking columnist in New York who steals all her recipes from a Hungarian restaurateur who likes her and gives her, and yes, use my stuff and just put it in there. And she claims to be this wonderful housewife who lives in rural Connecticut on a farm and has a husband and kids and animals and makes everything from scratch. And all of this is not remotely true. And because she has a long-distance relationship with her editor, played by Sidney Greenstreet, speaking of people who hardly ever did comedy, she just kind of buffaloes him, and he thinks that's who she is. Well, a returning war hero comes back, and the magazine she writes for decides to give this guy a Christmas he'll never forget at the cooking columnist's farm in Connecticut. So she has to come up with a husband, a farm, some animals, a kid, and it has to be up in Connecticut. And the machinations of how she goes through falsifying her existence. And of course, in a movie like that, there will be a comeuppance, and she'll realize that she's not that person and she's better off being who she really is. That stuff's in there, of course. And it's very funny to watch her transform herself into something she's not and then untransform herself into the person that we know she really ought to be. The male lead is a guy named Dennis Morgan, who is basically a hairline and some very shiny teeth. He's not a great actor, but he's a nice singer, and he sings a couple of songs. And I think if you've never watched that, even though it's fairly predictable, I think you'll really like it. So I recommend it. The next movie on the list is one I watched 2 weeks ago, so you can trust my opinion. It's fresh. It's called We're No Angels. I guess this is sort of the group of actors who don't do many comedies, because Humphrey Bogart is the star of that. And he is a prisoner on Devil's Island. He's a forger, and he's with two extremely amiable murderers played by Peter Ustinov and Aldo Ray. And they bust out of Devil's Island. They get out of the prison, but you may know Devil's Island is on an island. It's not just a prison, there's a town. So they get out into the town hoping to sneak onto a boat, get out of there, go back to France. And they hide above in the attic of a shop. And as they watch the family in the shop and they figure out, oh, he's got financial troubles and he's going to be foreclosed on by an evil landlord, and the daughter is pursued by somebody that is rich, but she doesn't love him. She loves this other guy. They decide to intervene and straighten out all the family's problems in some novel ways. And it's just a strange mix of stuff that they do that's not wholesome, but is still pretty funny. And watching Aldo Ray, who is this big burly guy, very blunt, and Peter Ustinov, who has these little dry, witty one-liners, and Bogart, who's playing it super straight but is still very funny, has these three convicts. It's been remade multiple times, but the one from 1955 is the best. Also, Michael Curtiz, who's most famous for pairing with Bogart in Casablanca, worked with him on many other films, Passage to Marseille and others. This is the last time they worked together. Curtiz died the next year, I think. He didn't live much longer. And Bogart also didn't live a whole lot longer. They were both of them in bad health. It doesn't show in Bogart's case, but this was the last kind of major film Curtiz made, and it was one of the last couple that Bogart made. We're No Angels. Then we're going to jump 50 years. Not that I couldn't find good Christmas movies in between, but There's one that is really, this is one that's not funny, and it's heartwarming in just the right way. Critics don't like that adjective much. Even I don't like it. It sounds like something that they took off a Hallmark card. But it is a heartwarming film. It's called Joyeux Noël. It was originally billed as Silent Night, but you don't want Silent Night, which is a TV movie about the same thing. Not that it's bad. You want Joyeux Noël. This is the one that was nominated for an Oscar for Best Foreign Film. There was a real incident in World War I where the war had only been going on at that point in 1914 for about 5 months, roughly, by Christmas. It was started by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke in Serbia, and then other countries got involved, and all these treaties obligated everybody to pile all in. But at this point, the Germans and the French and the English, in this case it's a Scottish regiment, had a hard time hating each other because they had all been Western European powers that had not fought for quite a while. And they were suspicious of each other, but there wasn't this sort of World War II-like, kill the evil enemy. They're demonic. These were people that recognized the enemy as people. So at Christmas, this actually happened in no man's land in France. They started speaking across the lines to each other. And one of them, a German, was a tenor, and he got up and sang. And the people on the Allied forces applauded him. And he stood up to see who it was. And they stood up and they clapped. And pretty soon they found themselves in the middle of no man's land, not shooting each other. I think they played a soccer game, or a football game, as they would tell us to call it. And they realized all this time, we're going to have to go back to shooting each other fairly soon. And if our superior officers find out about this, we're going to be sent to some awful places that are a lot less decent than where we are now, and a lot more dangerous places. And our punishment will be, you did what with the enemy? You shared a drink with them at Christmas? Are you insane? So they're balancing their military careers and what's going to have to happen after the Christmas truce is over with a feeling that I'm with people that if I knew them, I could not hate them. And that catches me every time. I put in here that the best anti-war films don't always show carnage. They don't always show how horrible and war is and how brutal and what the psychological or physical traumas are that people have to go through. Try to remember, I'm not sure a shot is fired in this. I'm really pretty sure that nobody's killed. But it shows, especially World War I, where after it was over, people realized we fought over an assassination that had nothing to do with any of us, really. But all these binding treaties forced us to become enemies. After that happened, I did want to say one other thing about holiday movies. The best holiday movies don't adhere to a template. Somebody who's not here, I should say, asked me if I was going to talk about a movie that she really loves, which is Four Christmases. And I thought, I don't know, I don't remember it very well. Let me look back and see what I said about it. And it's very entertaining, but also in the first 5 minutes of the movie, you know exactly what's going to happen at point 15, point 25, point 35. And for me, that makes it difficult to respond to a film, not just because I know the plot, but because I feel like I'm on an assembly line where you're building a product. And so a lot of the holiday films, there's one called Jingle All the Way, where Arnold Schwarzenegger is looking for a toy for his son at Christmas. And he goes through all of these tremendous adventures to try to get this rare, completely unavailable toy. And I can't even remember if he gets it or not. But theoretically, the point of it is Christmas isn't really about toys. It's about loving your family. But the movie looks exactly like it was manufactured by a committee and then put through a machine. And that is unfortunately what holiday movies often look like to me, which is why Jingle All the Way is not on this list. And I think that it tends to be a template where people say, oh, I think on page 40 of the script, this has to happen. And then they make sure that it does. So if there are movies that you're thinking, why didn't he talk about Elf, which I personally hate, I'll just say that. Doesn't mean it's not a good movie. Remember always, the fact that I don't like something doesn't mean it's not good. The fact that I do like something doesn't mean it is. But I'm not an Elf fan. But Elf is a movie made by a machine. Home Alone is a movie made by a machine. A good machine. It's very, very well put together. And who doesn't like to see bowling balls dropped on people's heads over and over? But it seems like it was made by a committee and run through a machine. And those are not the movies I'm bringing to you today. And that doesn't mean that those movies are bad. It means they're uniform and, to me, not really distinguishable one from the other.
Okay, that's it from the Sharon. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Charlotte Ledger Podcast, which was produced by Lindsay Banks. This episode was presented by Child Care Search, helping families find safe, quality childcare with free referrals and support every step of the way. You can find out more at findchildcarenc.org or call 1-888-600-1685 to talk to a child care navigator today.
QueenCityPodcastNetwork.com.